small gesture from an elderly woman went unnoticed by every customer in that ordinary supermarket on a Tuesday afternoon. No one noticed. No one saw. No one paid attention to the distress signal she desperately tried to transmit as she walked beside a man in a suit. But there was someone there who saw everything. Someone trained to detect what humans ignored. Someone whose instincts never failed. And that someone wasn't human. What happened next in aisle 7 would expose a truth hidden for months, and prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are those who see us when we become invisible. Welcome to our channel. Here, you'll discover surprising stories that spark your curiosity and move your heart. Make sure to subscribe for more high-quality content just like this. And now, let's get into the video. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song above the Valley Ridge supermarket, casting that peculiar glow that makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly staged. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that drags itself through the hours, with neither urgency nor purpose, when most people are at work and the store belongs to retirees, shift workers, and the occasional parent with a stroller. The produce section smelled of wet lettuce and something faintly sweet. Maybe the strawberries stacked in their plastic containers, their red bodies pressed together like commuters on a train. Margaret Ashford moved through the automatic doors with the kind of grace that money can buy, but time inevitably erodes. She was 73, though she would have told you 71 if you'd asked, and she wore her wealth the way some women wear perfume, subtly but unmistakably. Her coat was cashmere, dove gray, cut in a style that whispered Parisian boutique rather than department store. Her hair, silver and precisely styled, caught the harsh supermarket lighting and somehow made it look softer. Pearl earrings, a Hermes scarf, knotted at her throat. Everything about her suggested a woman who had never had to check a price tag, never had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying groceries. But her eyes told a different story entirely. They were the eyes of a woman drowning in plain sight, of someone screaming into a silence so complete that even she had begun to doubt the sound of her own voice. Dark circles bloomed beneath them despite the careful application of concealer. The whites were threaded with red, suggesting either tears or sleeplessness or both. And there was something else there. Something that flickered and died and flickered again like a candle struggling against a drift, a quality that those who have never been truly afraid might mistake for tiredness, what was actually terror distilled and aged and served neat. Beside her walked a man in a suit, charcoal gray, expensive, tailored to emphasize broad shoulders and a trim waist. He was, perhaps, 45. With the kind of generic handsomeness that belongs on corporate websites and dating apps. The sort of face that's pleasant but forgettable, distinguished by nothing in particular except its very ordinary. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples in a way that suggested maturity and trustworthiness. His smile, when he deployed it, was warm and practiced, a tool honed through years of use. His hand rested on Margaret's elbow, guiding her through the store with a solicitousness that might have looked caring to a casual observer, but his fingers pressed too hard. His grip was steel wrapped in the pretense of gentleness. "We'll just get a few things for dinner," he said, his voice pitched at that perfect volume that carries two nearby shoppers without seeming to project. "You mentioned you wanted to make that salmon recipe, didn't you, Mother?" Mother. The word hung in the air like a lie told so many times it had started to believe itself. Margaret nodded, a movement so small it was nearly imperceptible. She said nothing. Her lips, painted a tasteful coral, remained pressed together as if she'd forgotten how to open them, as if words had become a language she no longer spoke. They moved past the pharmacy section, past the birthday cards and seasonal displays, past the bakery, where the smell of fresh bread should have been inviting, but instead seemed cloying, suffocating. In aisle 3, near the canned goods, Officer Marcus June was thinking about retirement. Not his own. He was only 30, with at least 20 more years before that particular horizon, but his father's, coming up in 6 months. His dad had been a cop too, 35 years walking the same streets. And Marcus was trying to figure out what you buy, a man who had spent his entire adult life keeping other people safe. What do you give someone whose job it was to notice what others missed? Beside Marcus, sitting with the patient alertness that only the truly professional can maintain, was Rex. He was a German Shepherd, 4 years old, 65 pounds of muscle, instinct, and training condensed into a form that could be both intimidating and, to those who knew dogs, utterly beautiful. His coat was the classic black and tan. His ears stood at attention, and his eyes dark, intelligent, constantly processing missed nothing. Rex was 3 years into his career as a police dog, and in that time he'd found 2 missing children, detected drugs in 17 vehicle stops, tracked a robbery suspect through 4 miles of woods, and once memorably located an elderly man with dementia who wandered away his care facility and fallen into a drainage ditch. Rex understood the world through a language humans could barely comprehend, a symphony of sense that told stories words never could. He knew fear, anxiety, aggression, illness, contraband. He knew the smell of a person who'd been drinking, who'd been using, who'd been crying. He knew the particular scent signature of someone who was lost, and he knew, perhaps most importantly, the smell of someone who was being hurt. The department had sent Marcus and Rex to the supermarket for a community outreach thing, one of those feel-good initiatives where kids could meet a police dog and parents could ask questions about neighborhood safety. They'd set up a small table near the customer service desk, and for the past hour, Rex had been patient with small hands patting his head and squeaky voices, asking if he could smell bad guys. Marcus had explained over and over that Rex was trained to detect specific scents, that he was a working dog, that yes, he did get treats. And no, being a police dog wasn't scary for him. It was what he was born to do. Have you ever wondered what makes a moment before everything changes feel different? Or is it only in retrospect that we assign it significance? Maybe there's something in the air, some shift in atmospheric pressure, some quantum fluctuation that we sense without knowing we sense it. The universe taking a breath before speaking. The transformation was subtle but absolute. The way water becomes ice, the way day becomes night at that precise instant when the sun drops below the horizon. One moment Rex was in what Marcus called his public mode, alert but relaxed, performing the role of ambassador between law enforcement and community. The next moment every muscle in his body had tensed. His head had snapped toward aisle 7, and a low whine had started in his throat, barely audible but unmistakable to anyone who knew dogs, who understood that sound. It was the sound of recognition, of alarm, of a dog who had found what he'd been trained to find, even though he hadn't been looking for it. Rex. Marcus's hand went to his partner's head, a gesture of both inquiry and reassurance. "What is it, boy?" The dog's nose was working overtime now, nostrils flaring, pulling in great drafts of air and processing them through an olfactory system so sophisticated that trying to compare it to human smell was like comparing a symphony orchestra to a kazoo. He was locked onto something, someone with the kind of focus that couldn't be distracted or dismissed. His tail, usually wagging during these public events, had gone still and straight. His ears were forward, every line of his body pointing like an arrow towards something Marcus couldn't see. And then Rex began to pull. Not the casual tug of a dog who wants to investigate an interesting smell, but the insistent, powerful pull of a working dog who has detected what he's been trained to detect. Marcus let him move, trusting the instincts that had been honed through thousands of hours of training, trusting the nose that had never yet led him wrong. They moved past the in-cap display of potato chips, past the teenagers stocking shelves with canned soup, past an elderly man comparing prices on coffee. And then Marcus saw her, the woman in the expensive coat, moving slowly through the international foods section with a man's hand on her elbow. There was nothing overtly wrong with the scene, nothing that would have triggered an alarm in a human observer. Just a well-dressed elderly woman shopping with what appeared to be her son, a tableau so ordinary it was nearly invisible, the kind of thing you'd see and forget in the same instant. But Rex saw something else, smelled something else. The dog's training had included what handlers called distress detection, a specialized skill that not all police dogs possessed. Rex had been taught to identify the chemical markers of extreme fear, the hormones that flood a person's system when they're in danger, the subtle pheromones that the human brain does unconsciously register, but that a dog's nose catches, like a searchlight, catches movement in darkness, cortisol, adrenaline, the particular scent signature of a person whose fight-or-flight response has been activated so many times it has become their default state. Rex could smell Margaret's fear from 30 feet away, and it was calling to him like a siren. They moved closer. Marcus kept his hand on Rex's lead, maintaining control but allowing the dog to guide their path. The ordinary sounds of the supermarket continued around them, the beep of scanners at the checkout, someone's cart with a squeaky wheel, the soft rock playing through overhead speakers, but they seemed distant now, muffled, as if Marcus and Rex had entered a bubble where normal rules didn't quite apply. 20 feet away. 15. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for a jar of pasta sauce. The movement was slight, probably invisible to the man beside her, but Marcus saw it. The way her fingers shook, the way she pulled her hand back without taking the jar, the way she glanced at the man, a quick, darting look that contained within it an entire universe of fear and calculation, trying to gauge whether this small failure would anger him, whether the consequences would come now or later, whether there would be consequences at all, or if this would be one of the times he let something slide. The man in the suit noticed none of this, or perhaps he did and simply didn't care. His attention was on his phone, scrolling through something with his thumb, his other hand still maintaining that proprietary grip on Margaret's elbow. Only she disguised a scare 10 feet away. No, and then Margaret turned her head, and her eyes met Rex's. Time stopped for a breath. The universe held its inhale. She looked at the dog, and something passed between them, some communication that transcended species and language and operated on a level so fundamental it might as well have been telepathy. Margaret had never learned the formal hand signals for distress, had never been taught the subtle ways people can communicate "I need help" without words, but she knew in that moment of connection that the dog understood, that he saw her, that Airy knew. Her right hand came up slowly, trembling, and moved to her left shoulder, then to her right hip, then back to her left shoulder. The movements were small, contained, but deliberate. A pattern, a signal, something she'd seen in a video years ago before her life had collapsed into this nightmare before the man who called himself her caretaker had isolated her so completely that she'd begun to believe rescue was a fairy tale told to children who still believed in happy endings. It wasn't an official police signal. It wasn't ASL or military code or any formal system of communication. It was just a gesture, a desperate attempt to convey what her voice couldn't say, what her imprisoned situation wouldn't allow her to speak aloud. "Help me, please. Someone help me." Rex's response was immediate and unmistakable. He balked. A sound so sharp and commanding that every person within 30 feet turned to look. Not the friendly bark of a dog greeting someone he liked, not the warning bark of a dog protecting territory. This was the alert bark the sound Rex made when he'd found something, when his training and instincts aligned to tell him that this right here, this was what mattered. This was why he existed. This was the job. The man in the suit looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to something harder, colder. "Control your dog, officer," he said. His voice died. "You're disturbing shoppers." But Marcus had seen Margaret's gesture, had seen her eyes, had seen the way she'd frozen when Rex barked, as if even this attention, this potential intervention, was terrifying because she'd learned that any deviation from the script brought consequences. If you've ever witnessed something that made you question everything you thought you understood about a situation, you know that feeling of the ground shifting beneath your feet, of reality rearranging itself into a configuration you didn't see coming. Maybe you felt that moment when puzzle pieces that seemed random suddenly form a picture, and the picture is darker than you imagined. Marcus's training kicked in, but so did something else, something more fundamental than training, the instinct that had made him become a cop in the first place. The bone-deep certainty that something was very, very wrong. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Margaret directly, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you all right?" The man in the suit stepped between them, smooth as oil, his professional smile firmly in place. "My mother is fine, officer. She has dementia. Sometimes she gets confused, acts strangely. I'm her primary caregiver. I'm taking her home now." But Rex was still barking, still pulling toward Margaret, and his training had included something else, something that most people didn't know about. Police dogs trained in victim assistance develop an instinct that goes beyond commands, beyond the simple mechanics of sit, stay, heal. They learn to read human vulnerability the way poets read emotion, the way musicians read silence between notes. Rex had been taught that certain people needed protection more than others, that the elderly, the very young, the visibly afraid, occupied a special category in his working world. They were the ones who couldn't always fight back, couldn't always speak up, couldn't always escape the dangers that found them. Margaret was all of those things at once, and Rex knew it with the certainty of instinct, verified by training. Marcus stepped around the man in the suit, maintaining eye contact with Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Marcus Chun with the Valley Ridge Police Department." "This is my partner, Rex. He's trained to detect when someone is in distress, and he's indicating that you might need help. I need you to answer me directly. Are you safe?" The man's hand tightened on Margaret's elbow. Just for an instant, a flash of pressure that made her flinch. It was subtle enough that someone not looking for it might have missed it, but Marcus, who was looking for it, had been trained to look for exactly these kinds of micro-expressions, these tiny tells that revealed the truth beneath the surface performance. "Officer, I appreciate your concern, but as I said, my mother has dementia," the man said, his voice taking on an edge of impatience carefully calibrated to sound reasonable, put upon the tone of a dutiful son dealing with bureaucratic inconvenience. "She doesn't always know what she's saying or doing. I have power of attorney. I can show you the paperwork if necessary. This is harassment." But Margaret had started to cry. silently, tears rolling down her carefully made-up face, tracking through her foundation, and leaving clean trails on her powdered cheeks. Her mouth opened and closed, like someone trying to remember how speech worked, like someone who had been silent for so long that words had become foreign objects, stones in her throat. "Please," she finally whispered, the word so soft it was barely audible over the supermarket's background noise. "Please help me." The room froze. Every person within earshot stopped what they were doing. A woman holding a can of tomatoes, a stockboy with his hand in a cardboard box, an elderly man leaning on his cot. All of them witnesses to a moment that would divide time into before and after, into the period when they didn't know and the period when they did. The man in the suit's mask slipped, just for a second. His professional smile cracked, and beneath it Marcus saw something cold and calculating, a kind of rage that had been simmering beneath the surface all along, waiting for the right conditions to boil over. She doesn't know what she's saying. The dementia makes her paranoid, confused. "I'm taking her home." He moved to pull Margaret away, but Rex was already between them. 75 pounds of trained law enforcement officer who happened to have fur. The dog didn't bite, didn't attack, simply positioned himself as a living barrier between Margaret and the man, his body language unmistakable. "You're not taking her anywhere?" "Sir, I need you to take your hand off her arm," Marcus said, and his voice had changed, dropped into that register cops use when they're done asking and have started telling. "Now, this is ridiculous. I'm calling my lawyer." But the man's hand had released Margaret's elbow, and she stumbled backward away from him, her expensive coat catching on a shelf and knocking over a jar of olives. They shattered on the linoleum floor, green spheres rolling in every direction, like tiny planets escaping their orbit. Marcus keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need backup at Valley Ridge Supermarket, aisle 7. Possible elder abuse situation. Also need apps notified. Adult Protective Services." The words hung in the air like an indictment. The man's face had gone from charming to furious. The transformation so complete, it was like watching a different person emerge from inside the first one. "You have no right. She's my mother." "I take care of her. I gave up my career to take care of her. Do you know what that means? Do you know what I've sacrificed?" But Margaret was shaking her head, back and forth, tears streaming down her face. "Not my son," she managed, her voice getting stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth was feeding something in her that had been starving for months. "Not my son. Never my son. My son is dead." "Dead 3 years. He said he was a friend, said he would help me, said he knew about finances and I needed help after Richard died. My husband. Richard died and I was alone and he said he would help." The story tumbled out in fragments, puzzle pieces that Marcus had to mentally assemble as he kept his position between Margaret and the man who definitely wasn't her son. How the man had been at her husband's funeral, had approached her during the reception, had offered condolences and business cards and expertise in estate management. How he'd seemed kind, professional, trustworthy. How she'd signed papers she didn't fully understand because grief made everything foggy, and he'd been so reassuring, so competent, so there when she needed someone to be there. How, by the time she realized what she'd signed, it was too late. He had power of attorney. He had access to her accounts. He had keys to her house. He had, quite methodically and carefully, taken over every aspect of her life, isolating her from her remaining friends, from her daughter, who lived across the country, from anyone who might ask questions or notice that something was wrong. He monitors everything, Margaret said, the words coming faster now. A damn breaking. My phone, my computer, my mail. He says it's because I'm confused, because I might make mistakes, might get scammed. But he's the one. He's stealing from me. Thousands. Tens of thousands. I saw the bank statements once, before he started hiding them. I tried to call my daughter, but he'd changed my phone plan, put parental controls on it. I'm 73 years old, and I have parental controls on my phone. I tried to go to the bank, but he comes with me everywhere. Says it's because I might get lost. I tried to tell my doctor, but he found a new doctor for me. Someone who doesn't know me, and he's in every appointment, answering all the questions, telling them I'm confused. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held equal parts hope and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite accept that this was happening, that someone had finally heard her, finally seen her. I saw something online, a video about a signal you could make if you were in trouble. I practiced it in the bathroom, the only place he can't watch me. I thought if I ever got a chance, if there was ever a moment, I would try. But I never thought anyone would understand, never thought anyone would care. The man who wasn't her son had gone quiet, his face carefully neutral, clearly calculating his next move. Marcus recognized that look, the expression of someone running through scenarios, weighing options, trying to find the angle that would let them escape consequences. He'd seen it in domestic abusers when their partners finally called the police. He'd seen it in thieves caught mid. He'd seen it in people who had convinced themselves that what they were doing was unreally wrong. Or if it was wrong, it was justified, rationalized, somehow acceptable, given the circumstances they'd invented to explain their behavior. Backup arrived then. 2 patrol officers, Marcus Newell, Sarah Kim, and David Torres. He gave them a quick rundown while Rex remained positioned protectively near. Margaret, the dog's presence, seeming to give her strength, as if his certainty that she deserved protection was helping her remember that she wasn't crazy or confused or paranoid, that what had been happening to her was real and wrong and criminal. The man was escorted away, still protesting, still insisting this was a misunderstanding, still trying to deploy the mask of reasonable concern, even as it fell apart in his hands. Marcus watched them read him his rights, watched them put him in the back of the patrol car, watched the vehicle pull away with its cargo of professional charm and calculated exploitation. Margaret sat on a bench near customer service, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought from somewhere, holding a cup of water with hands that still trembled but less than before. Rex sat beside her, and she kept one hand on his head, fingers buried in his fur, holding on as if he were an anchor, keeping her from drifting away. "He saved me," she said, looking at the dog. "Your partner saved me." Marcus crouched down beside them. He did. That's what he's trained for, but it's also just who he is. The supermarket had transformed into a kind of impromptu command center, one of those temporary nodes of intense activity that spring up when something significant happens, when the ordinary world has to make room for intervention and investigation and the machinery of justice cranking into motion. An APS worker arrived, a woman in her 50s named Janet Reeves, who had the efficient compassion of someone who'd seen this scenario play out in dozens of variations, who knew how to be both gentle and professional, how to gather information without making a traumatized person feel interrogated. Margaret told her story again, in more detail this time, with Janet taking notes on a tablet and asking clarifying questions in a voice that conveyed both authority and sympathy. The timeline that emerged was damning in its methodical cruelty. The man, whose real name was Thomas Brennan, had apparently made a career of this particular kind of exploitation. He targeted wealthy widows and widowers in their vulnerable period of grief, presented himself as a financial advisor or estate planner or a helpful friend, gained their trust, and then systematically took control of their lives and assets. He'd done it legally, or legal enough, that unraveling it would take lawyers and time and forensic accountants. That was the genius of his approach. He operated in that gray zone between criminal fraud and aggressive financial management, always making sure he had paperwork, always ensuring his victims signed documents that could be interpreted as consent, always maintaining the appearance of a caregiver acting in his charge's best interest. If anyone questioned him, he had explanations. He had papers, he had medical reports from doctors who'd seen the victims only once or twice. I had no baseline for comparison. Who took his word that, yes, these people were declining, were confused, needed someone to make decisions for them. Margaret hadn't been his first victim. She wouldn't have been his last. "The signal you made?" Janet said, looking up from her tablet. "Where did you learn that?" Margaret's hand was still resting on Rex's head, the gesture seeming to ground her, to remind her she was safe now, that she could speak freely without consequences. "A video? Online, maybe 2 months ago. It was about trafficking, about ways to signal for help when you can't speak. I never thought I'd need it. I never thought my life would become something I needed to escape from." Her voice cracked on that last word, the weight of months of fear and isolation and gaslighting, pressing down on her all at once, now that she was finally safe enough to feel it. That was the thing about trauma. Marcus knew. Sometimes you couldn't afford to fall apart when you were in danger, so your body and mind held everything together with wire and willpower and adrenaline. And it was only later, when the immediate threat had passed, that the delayed shock arrived like a freight train. Janet reached across and squeezed Margaret's free hand. "You were incredibly brave and smart. You found a way to ask for help when he'd taken away every other avenue. That took awareness and courage and determination." "I felt so stupid," Margaret whispered, "for letting him into my life, for signing those papers, for not seeing what he was doing until it was too late." "No," Janet's voice was firm. "You were grieving. He exploited that. He's done this before, and he was good at it, practiced at it. This wasn't your fault. Not any part of it. You're a victim, not an accomplice to what he did to you." Marcus had heard this conversation before, had seen how hard it was for victims of manipulation to accept that they had even been foolish or weak, that skilled predators are called predators precisely because they're good at hunting, good at identifying vulnerability and exploiting it. The shame victims felt was often as damaging as the original crime, sometimes more so because it lived inside them and kept poisoning long after the external threat had been removed. Rex shifted slightly, pressing more of his weight against Margaret's leg, and she looked down at him with an expression that contained wonder and gratitude in equal measure. "How did he know?" she asked. "How did he understand?" "Dogs can smell fear," Marcus explained. "Not fear like being afraid of a horror movie, but real biochemical fear, the kind that comes from prolonged danger. Your body was producing stress hormones. Had been for months probably, and Rex picked up on that. He's also trained to recognize certain distress signals, and when you made that gesture, he understood you were asking for help, even if it wasn't a signal he'd been specifically taught. So he's not just a police dog. He's a guardian." Marcus smiled. "That's a better way to put it than I've ever managed. Yeah, he's a guardian." A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, other shoppers who'd witnessed some or all of what had happened, who'd seen Rex's intervention and Margaret's tears and the man being taken away in handcuffs. One of them, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, I just wanted to say to the lady that I'm glad you're okay, and that you were right to ask for help, and that you're not alone." Margaret looked up at her, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or solidarity, or simply the human need to acknowledge another person's suffering and survival. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "Thank you for saying that." Others came forward then, one by one, offering similar words. A young mother, an elderly man, a teenager who looked uncomfortable but determined. They formed a spontaneous receiving line of compassion. These strangers, who had no obligation to Margaret beyond the basic human duty to see each other, to care, to witness. Marcus watched and felt something shift in his chest. That particular emotion that made this job worth doing despite the long hours and the danger and the bureaucracy and the pension that would never be enough. This moment, this reminder that people were fundamentally good, fundamentally decent, fundamentally wired to help each other when given the chance. By the time Margaret's daughter arrived, having caught the first flight she could get after, Janet called her Margaret, was sitting in the supermarket's break room with a cup of hot tea, wrapped in a donated jacket still touching Rex's fur like a talisman. Her daughter, Diane, burst through the door with the wild-eyed panic of someone who'd spent 6 hours on planes imagining the worst, who'd been blocked from calling her mother for months by a man who'd changed phone numbers and email addresses and lied about messages being delivered. "Mom. Oh, God, Mom." Diane was crying before she even reached her, and then they were holding each other, and Margaret was crying too, but differently than before. These were clean tears, cathartic tears, the kind that wash away accumulated poison rather than adding to it. Marcus gave them privacy, stepping outside with Rex, letting them have their reunion without an audience. The sun was lower now, painting the parking lot in shades of amber and gold, transforming the ordinary landscape into something momentarily beautiful, the way light sometimes does right before it disappears. He knelt down and looked at Rex, really looked at him, this partner who asked for nothing but food and work and the occasional ear scratch, who gave everything in return, who had just saved a woman's life without even fully understanding what he'd done, acting purely on training and instinct and that mysterious quality that made some dogs capable of bonding with humans in ways that transcended the usual boundaries between species. "Good boy," Marcus said, and Rex's tail wagged happy to hear the praise, but not needing it. Not doing this for treats or approval, but because it was what he was, what he'd been bred and trained and essentially designed to do. "You're such a good boy." Inside, Janet was arranging for Margaret to be examined by a doctor who specialized in elder abuse, who would document injuries and malnutrition and the psychological toll of months of captivity disguised as care. Lawyers would get involved, would work to untangle the legal mess Thomas Brennan had created, would fight to recover Margaret's assets and autonomy. There would be criminal charges, investigations, possibly federal involvement, given the likelihood that Brennan had operated across state lines, had multiple victims, had systematically defrauded and imprisoned vulnerable people for profit. It would be complicated. It would take time, but it would happen because Margaret had found a way to ask for help, and because Rex had understood, and because the universe had aligned in just the right way to allow intervention before it was too late. A silence heavier than truth settled over the parking lot, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of Rex's fur in the evening breeze. 3 weeks later, Marcus and Rex returned to the Valley Ridge supermarket, not for another community outreach event, but for something different. Something the store manager had specifically requested. The local news had covered Margaret's rescue, had run a story about the police dog who detected a woman in distress, had interviewed Janet from a PS about the warning signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation. The story had gone viral, the way certain stories do when they combine heroism and justice and a happy ending, when they offer people a chance to feel hopeful about humanity while also learning something important. The supermarket's back room had been decorated with streamers and balloons, a celebration organized by employees and regular customers who'd been moved by what happened. Margaret was there, looking healthier than she had 3 weeks ago, the haunted quality in her eyes replaced by something lighter. Though Marcus suspected it would be a long time before the shadows fully disappeared. Trauma didn't work on a schedule, didn't heal according to arbitrary time. She'd need therapy, time, the patient support of people who understood that recovery was a marathon, not a sprint. Diane was with her, protective and attentive, but not smothering, having learned the hard way about the dangers of assumption, of taking for granted that your parents were fine just because they said they were, just because they seemed to be managing. She'd blamed herself in those first days after the rescue for not seeing the signs, for accepting Brennan's explanations about why her mother wasn't returning calls, wasn't answering emails. Marcus had heard her beating herself up in the hospital waiting room, and he told her what he told Margaret. Skilled predators are good at what they do, and the guilt belonged to the perpetrator, not the victims or their families. She'd heard him, but he knew she'd carry some of that guilt anyway. That was how love worked sometimes, how responsibility felt when you cared deeply about someone. You couldn't always logic away the feeling that you should have known, should have done something, should have been there. The store manager, a cheerful man named Bob Peterson, who'd worked in grocery retail for 30 years, called for everyone's attention. The assembled crowd, maybe 50 people, a mix of store employees, regular customers, local police officers who'd heard about the event, and a few reporters who'd asked to document it, quieted down. Faces turned expectantly toward the front of the room where Rex sat patiently beside Marcus, probably wondering why there were so many people and whether any of them had treats. We're here today to honor an extraordinary act of service. Bob said, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone who'd given many speeches about sales targets and customer satisfaction, but had never had occasion to talk about heroism before. 3 weeks ago, in aisle 7 of our store, Officer Marcus Chun and his partner Rex intervened in a situation that might otherwise have ended very differently. They saved a life, and we wanted to take this moment to say thank you and to recognize Rex for his incredible instincts and training. Applause filled the room, and Rex's ears perked up, picking up on the general atmosphere of approval, even if he didn't understand the specific reasons for it. Marcus felt his throat tighten slightly, that embarrassed pride that came from public recognition for doing what felt like just another day's work, just another instance of showing up and trying to help. Margaret stepped forward then, moving with more confidence than she'd had 3 weeks ago. Though Marcus noticed, Diane stayed close, a subtle safety net. She held something wrapped in brown paper, tied with a simple ribbon. "I wanted to thank you," she said, addressing both Marcus and Rex, though her eyes kept moving to the dog, to this animal who'd somehow understood her desperate signal and had refused to be ignored. "Thank you for seeing me when I'd become invisible. Thank you for hearing me when I couldn't speak. Thank you for believing me when I'd stopped believing myself." She knelt down, a bit stiffly, but with determination, and Rex stood to meet her, his tail wagging now because he remembered her scent and her fear and the way she'd touched his fur like a lifeline. She unwrapped the package, revealing a leather collar, custom-made, with Rex's name engraved on a brass plate, along with a simple inscription. "Guardian?" "I asked them to put that word," Margaret said, her voice wobbling slightly, Because that's what you are. That's what you did for me. You guarded me when no one else could. She fastened the collar around Rex's neck, replacing his standard work collar with this gift, this token of gratitude from a woman who learned firsthand how much difference one moment of attention could make, how the universe sometimes aligned in ways that looked like coincidence but felt like grace. There's something profound about being truly seen in your darkest moment, isn't there? About having someone recognize your suffering and refuse to look away. Maybe you've experienced that kind of witness, or maybe you've been the one doing the witnessing. Either way, you understand how it changes everything, how it reminds us we're not as alone as we sometimes feel. Marcus found himself blinking back unexpected emotion as he watched this exchange. This ceremony between a traumatized woman and a dog who'd helped save her. Rex, for his part, seemed pleased with the attention, the new collar, the general atmosphere of celebration. He licked Margaret's face, and she laughed, a sound of pure joy that probably hadn't emerged from her in months. The local news interviewed them afterward, asking the standard questions about training and instincts, and what civilians should know about recognizing signs of abuse. Marcus answered the professional queries while internally marveling at how something as simple as paying attention, as listening to what a well-trained dog was trying to communicate, had unraveled months of systematic exploitation and potentially saved not just Margaret but future victims who would never know how close they'd come to being Brennan's next targets. The investigation had revealed that Brennan had at least 4 previous victims, all elderly, all wealthy, all isolated either by geographies or circumstance. He'd been doing this for 7 years, moving from city to city, always careful to leave before questions became accusations, before suspicions hardened into evidence. But Margaret's case had given prosecutors something concrete, testimony and documentation, and a clear pattern of behavior that would be much harder to explain away as misunderstanding or overzealous caregiving. He was facing multiple felony charges in 3 states. The legal machinery ground slowly but thoroughly, and Marcus had been told that between the fraud charges, the false imprisonment charges, and the elder abuse charges, Brennan was looking at decades in prison. If convicted, it wouldn't undo what he'd done, wouldn't return the money he'd stolen or the months he'd stolen from his victims' lives. But it would stop him from doing it again, and sometimes that was the best justice could offer. Not revenge, not perfect restoration, but prevention of future harm. After the ceremony, after the interviews, after the cake had been cut and consumed, Margaret asked Marcus if she could have a few minutes alone with Rex. He agreed, stepping back to let her have this moment, watching as she sat on a bench outside the supermarket. The same bench she'd sat on 3 weeks ago, wrapped in a blanket and shaking with delayed shock, and Rex sat beside her, patient and solid and present. Marcus couldn't hear what she said to the dog, but he saw her lips moving, saw her hands buried in his fur, saw the way she leaned into him like someone seeking shelter from a storm that had finally passed. Whatever words she spoke, they were hers and Rex's alone. A private conversation between a woman who'd been saved and the guardian who'd saved her. When she finally stood up, her eyes were wet, but her shoulders were straight, and she walked back to where Diane waited, with a smile that looked like the beginning of healing, like the first page of a new chapter in a life that had nearly been stolen but had been, at the last possible moment, Marcus drove back to the station with Rex in the back seat, the new collar catching the afternoon light, the word guardian gleaming. They had paperwork to file, reports to write, the ordinary bureaucracy that accompanied extraordinary events. Tomorrow there would be other calls, other situations, other people who needed help. That was the job. That was always the job. But today, for this moment, Marcus let himself feel the particular satisfaction that came from being exactly where you needed to be, at exactly the right time, from having a partner whose instincts were so finely tuned that he could detect suffering invisible to human senses, from being part of a system that, when it worked correctly, protected the vulnerable and held predators accountable. "Good boy," he said again, catching Rex's eyes in the rearview mirror. "You're such a good boy." And somewhere in the complicated dance between human and animal, between training and instinct, between duty and compassion, Rex understood that he'd done something important, something good, something that justified the trust placed in him and the badge he carried. The story could have ended there, with the ceremony and the collar and the promise of justice grinding forward through the legal system. But life rarely offers clean endings, and the reverberations of that afternoon in Aisle 7 continued to spread outward, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, touching lives and changing trajectories in ways that no one could have predicted. 2 months after the rescue, Marcus received a call from an assisted living facility in the neighboring county. The director, a woman named Patricia Morales, had seen the news coverage and wanted to bring Marcus and Rex in for a training session with her staff. She explained that elder abuse was more common than most people realized, that facilities like hers worked hard to prevent it, but that financial exploitation especially could be difficult to detect when it was being done by someone who appeared to be a legitimate caregiver or family member. "Your dog saw something my staff might have missed," Patricia said over the phone, her voice carrying the weight of professional responsibility. "I want them to learn what to look for, not just the obvious signs, but the subtle ones, the ones that hide in plain sight," Marcus agreed. And the following week, he and Rex found themselves in a conference room filled with caregivers, nurses, social workers, and administrators, all of them eager to understand how to better protect their residents. He talked about behavioral indicators, about isolation, about sudden changes in financial circumstances or living situations. He talked about how abusers often presented themselves as devoted caregivers, how they used medical conditions like dementia as cover for control, how they systematically cut off their victims from support systems and outside contact. And he talked about Rex, about how the dog's training allowed him to detect the physiological signs of chronic stress and fear, about how animals often perceived things humans missed because they weren't distracted by words and explanations, and the social performance that let predators hide in plain sight. "The signal Mrs. Ashford made," one of the nurses asked, the one she'd seen in the video. "Should we be teaching that to our residents? Should they know about it?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Yes and no," he said finally. "It's useful for people to know that there are ways to signal distress non-verbally, especially in situations where speaking openly might be dangerous. But the specific signal matters less than the awareness. What saved Mrs. Ashford wasn't just the gesture itself. It was that she was looking for an opportunity, that she was aware enough to recognize a potential help source when she saw one, that she didn't give up hope, even when her situation seemed hopeless." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The more important thing is creating an environment where people feel safe reporting concerns, where they know they'll be believed, where they understand that exploitation and abuse aren't their fault." Mrs. Ashford spent months thinking she'd been stupid, that she'd allowed this to happen. That shame kept her quiet almost as effectively as the actual isolation did. The staff members nodded, taking notes, asking questions. Rex lay at the front of the room, occasionally shifting position, but mostly just being present, his calm demeanor somehow reinforcing Marcus's points about awareness and attention and the importance of really seeing people rather than just looking at them. After the presentation, several staff members approached Marcus privately to share their own concerns about residents. Situations that hadn't quite crossed the line into obvious abuse, but that triggered their instincts, made them uneasy. Marcus listened to each one, took notes, promised to look into the cases that seemed most urgent. This was how systemic change happened. He thought not through dramatic interventions, but through education and awareness, and people learning to trust their instincts, learning that it was better to ask questions and be wrong than to stay silent and be right. Margaret herself had become something of an advocate, speaking at support groups for elder abuse survivors, sharing her story not as a cautionary tale but as a testament to resilience and recovery. She'd partnered with a PS2 develop educational materials, had started a foundation to help other victims recover financially from exploitation, had transformed her trauma into purpose in the way some people could, using pain as fuel for preventing others from experiencing the same harm. Marcus saw her occasionally at events or fundraisers, and each time she looked healthier, more herself, whatever self meant for someone who'd been fundamentally changed by their experience. She told him once, during a quiet moment at a benefit dinner, that she still thought about that afternoon in the supermarket, still marveled at the unlikely convergence of circumstances that had led to her rescue. "If you hadn't been there that day," she'd said, "if Rex hadn't been trained to detect distress, if I hadn't seen that video about the signal, if I hadn't made the gesture, if any one of those things had been different, I'd still be trapped or dead. He was planning to move me into a facility. Did you know that? One of those places where no one asks questions and visitors are discouraged. I would have disappeared completely." Marcus had acknowledged the truth of that, the razor-thin margin between salvation and continued suffering, but he'd also tried to shift her perspective slightly. "You saved yourself," he'd told her. "Rex and I just helped. You're the one who recognized the opportunity, who was brave enough to signal for help, despite being terrified of the consequences. You're the one who told the truth, even though you'd been conditioned to believe no one would believe you. That was all you." She'd smiled at that, a bit sadly, but also with a glimmer of acceptance. Trauma recovery involved rewriting the narrative he'd learned, helping people see themselves as survivors rather than victims, as active participants in their own rescue rather than passive recipients of someone else's heroism. The trial, when it finally happened 8 months after Margaret's rescue, was anticlimactic in the way most trials are: hours of testimony and evidence presentation that lacked the dramatic tension of television courtroom dramas but carried nonetheless the weight of real consequences for real people. Marcus testified about the initial intervention, about Rex's behavior, about the signs he'd observed that indicated Margaret was in immediate danger. Margaret testified, too, her voice stronger now, telling her story to a jury that listened with expressions ranging from horror to anger to deep sympathy. Thomas Brennan sat at the defense table looking nothing like the charming helper who de-insinuated himself into Margaret S.'s life, his mask fully stripped away to reveal the calculating predator beneath. His lawyers argued diminished capacity, misunderstanding, overzealous concern for Margaret's welfare. They tried to paint him as someone who'd made mistakes but hadn't acted with criminal intent, who'd been confused about the extent of his authority, who genuinely believed he was acting in Margaret's best interest. The jury didn't buy it. Neither did the judge, who, after the guilty verdict came in on all counts, delivered a scathing statement about the particular cruelty of exploiting vulnerable people in their time of grief, about the betrayal of trust that Brennan had engaged in, about the systematic and calculated nature of his crimes. The sentence was 23 years, with possibilities for additional time if other victims came forward and pressed charges, which several were already in the process of doing. Margaret was in the courtroom when the sentence was read, sitting between Diane and her friend from the support group. and Marcus saw her shoulders drop, saw a tension leave her body that he hadn't even realized she was carrying. Justice didn't erase what had happened, didn't return the months she'd lost or fully restore the sense of safety she'd had before, but it did acknowledge the reality of her experience, did validate her suffering, did say clearly and officially that what had been done to her was wrong and that the person who'd done it would face consequences. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Margaret hugged Marcus and knelt down to hug Rex. This ritual of gratitude she performed whenever she saw them, this need to physically express what words couldn't quite capture. Rex accepted the affection with his usual patience, tail wagging, probably hoping treats might be involved, but content either way, because this was a person he'd helped, a person whose scent had changed from fear to something more like peace, and dogs understood that transformation in ways humans could only approximate. "Thank you," Margaret said, for the 100th time, for the 1000th time, words that would never feel adequate, but were all language offered. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for caring. Thank you for not walking away." Marcus accepted the gratitude but deflected it too, redirecting her attention to her own courage, to the system that had, however imperfectly, ultimately worked, to the community that had rallied around her. He was just doing his job, he insisted, though they both knew it was more than that. That being good at this work required more than training and procedure, required something fundamental about how you saw other people, whether you believed they were worth protecting, worth fighting for. The seasons changed, as seasons do, indifferent to human drama. Summer gave way to fall. The supermarket began stocking pumpkin spice, everything, and life moved forward with its characteristic mixture of progress and setback, healing and hurt, hope and disappointment. Marcus continued his work with Rex, responding to calls, conducting searches, being present in the community in ways both visible and invisible. But something had shifted after Margaret's case, some fundamental recalibration of how he thought about the work, about what it meant to protect and serve. He'd always known, theoretically, that elder abuse was a problem, that financial exploitation happened, that vulnerable people fell through cracks in the system. But knowing something abstractly and witnessing it concretely were different experiences entirely, activated different neural pathways, triggered different levels of urgency and commitment. He found himself paying more attention to elderly people in his patrol areas, noticing who seemed isolated, who seemed fearful, who seemed to have caregivers that were more controlling than caring. Rex seemed different too, or maybe Marcus was just more attuned to what had always been there. The dog had always been observant, always been responsive to human emotion and distress, but now Marcus watched more carefully when Rex's attention locked onto someone, when his body language shifted into that alert mode that indicated he'd detected something worth investigating. They'd prevented 2 other potential exploitation situations in the months after. Margaret's rescue interventions that were less dramatic but no less important. Conversations with concerned neighbors or family members that led to investigations, that led to protections being put in place. The department had taken notice. Rex's instincts and training had proven valuable in ways that went beyond traditional police work. And there was talk of expanding the canine program to include specific training in victim assistance and distress detection. Marcus had been asked to help develop the curriculum, to share what he'd learned about reading Rex's signals, about recognizing situations where intervention might be needed even when no one had called for help. It was good work, important work, but it was also exhausting in ways that regular police work wasn't. There was something particularly draining about being constantly alert to human suffering, about training yourself to see past surfaces, to the fear and pain that people worked so hard to hide. Marcus found himself needing more time to decompress after shifts, more time with Rex, doing non-work activities, playing fetch in the park, going for runs on trails where the only thing they had to worry about was poison oak and whether they remembered to bring water. His father had noticed the change, had asked during one of their weekly dinners if everything was okay, if the job was getting to him. Marcus had struggled to articulate this feeling of having witnessed something that had shifted his entire perspective, like putting on glasses that let you see a spectrum of light that had always been there but that you'd been previously blind to. "It's like I understand now how much hidden suffering there is," he'd tried to explain. How many people are going through hell in private, behind closed doors, and the rest of us just walk past them at the grocery store or the bank or wherever, and we have no idea. And once you see it, once you really understand how common it is, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to assuming everyone's fine just because they look fine. His father, who had spent 35 years as a cop and had probably unseen plenty of things himself, had nodded with the understanding of someone who'd been through similar recalibrations. "That's the burden of awareness," he'd said. "It's also the responsibility. You know now, so you do something about it when you can, and you accept that you can't fix everything, and you try not to let the weight of all that invisible suffering crush you." It was good advice, though easier to hear than to implement. Marcus tried to find balance, tried to maintain the professional distance that let him function effectively while also staying connected enough to human emotion that he didn't become callous or burned out. Some days were easier than others. Some days he came home and lay on the floor with Rex and just existed for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just being alive and present with a partner who asked nothing from him except occasional food and the chance to work. The Valley Ridge supermarket had become something of a pilgrimage site, at least in the way that ordinary places could become extraordinary through association with significant events. People would occasionally approach Marcus when he and Rex were there, wanting to hear the story firsthand, wanting to meet the dog who'd saved someone's life. He obliged when he could, understanding that these stories mattered to people, that they represented proof that attention and compassion could make a tangible difference, that the world wasn't completely indifferent to suffering. The store itself had made some changes to training staff to recognize signs of distress, posting information about elder abuse and human trafficking in bathrooms and break rooms, creating a culture where employees felt empowered to speak up if they noticed something concerning. It wasn't a complete solutional single intervention ever was, but it was something, a ripple effect from that afternoon in aisle 7 that continued spreading outward in ways both measurable and mysterious. Margaret visited the store occasionally, deliberately choosing to reclaim a space that had been the site of both her captivity and her liberation. She'd told Marcus once that she could have gone to any supermarket, that there were dozens within reasonable driving distance, but that she needed to prove to herself that she could be there without fear, that she could walk those aisles without feeling the ghost of Brennan's hand on her elbow, without experiencing the panic that had been her constant companion during those months of exploitation. Trauma wants you to avoid places and situations that remind you of what happened, she'd explained, demonstrating the kind of psychological literacy that came from working with good therapists in doing the heart's internal work of recovery. But I refuse to let what he did to me dictate where I can go and what I can do. This is my community. This is my store. I'm not giving him that power. Diane had been skeptical at first, worried that forcing exposure before Margaret was ready would re-traumatize rather than heal. But the therapist had supported Margaret's instinct, had framed it as a reclamation rather than exposure, as an act of agency and defiance rather than something being imposed from outside. And it seemed to be working. Each visit got a little easier, the associations a little less fraught, the space a little more neutral, just a place to buy groceries rather than a monument to suffering. Rex had played a role in that too, his presence somehow making the space safer. Margaret would seek him out when Marcus brought him for visits, would spend a few minutes with the dog before doing her shopping, as if Rex was a talisman against the fear that still sometimes rose up unexpectedly, triggered by something as simple as a man in a gray suit or someone standing too close in the checkout line. The psychological architecture of trauma was complex, Marcus had learned, full of tripwires and landmines that could detonate without warning, sending someone right back to the worst moments of their experience. But it was also surprisingly resilient, capable of remodeling itself over time, building new neural pathways that bypassed the damage, creating new associations that didn't lead directly back to pain. On a cool afternoon in November, exactly 1 year after the initial intervention, the supermarket organized another gathering, smaller than the first ceremony, but no less meaningful. It wasn't about celebrating Rex this time, though he was certainly present and accounted for, soaking up attention from the assembled group. Instead, it was about acknowledging the ongoing work of prevention and recovery, about recognizing the multiple people and systems that had contributed to Margaret's rescue and rehabilitation. Janet from Apps was there, talking about new protocols her agency had implemented for detecting financial exploitation. Patricia from the assisted living facility shared data showing that after the training session with Marcus and Rex, her staff had identified and reported 3 cases of suspected abuse that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. A lawyer who'd worked pro bono to help Margaret recover her assets and untangle the legal mess Brennan had created spoke about the importance of accessible legal aid for exploitation victims. And Margaret herself spoke, not about her ordeal this time, but about hope, about the foundation she'd started, about the survivor network she was building, about her commitment to ensuring that what had happened to her would lead to systemic changes that protected others. She talked about the power of being believed, about the importance of community, about how rescue was never just one moment, but an ongoing process that required sustained support and attention. "A year ago, I was invisible," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I was suffering in plain sight, and no one saw me. Until someone did. Until a dog did. And that changed everything." The years that followed would prove that change, once initiated, had a momentum of its own, carrying forward even when the initial catalyst had faded from immediate memory. Marcus and Rex continued their work, their partnership deepening into something that transcended training and procedure, becoming instead a kind of shared consciousness, each so attuned to the other that communication happened through shifts in posture, changes in breathing, the subtle language of bodies occupying space together. Rex aged, as dogs do, his muzzle gradually whitening, his movements becoming slightly less explosive, more calculated. He remained sharp, his nose as reliable as ever, his instincts still finely tuned. But Marcus could see the clock ticking, could feel the approach of that inevitable day when his partner would retire, when someone else would take his place, when Rex would become a civilian dog after years of service. The thought brought a grief that Marcus wasn't quite ready to examine, a preemptive mourning for a loss that hadn't happened yet, but that cast its shadow forward nonetheless. Rex wasn't just a working partner, but a friend, a confidant, a presence that had shaped Marcus's adult life in ways both profound and quotidian. What would work be like without him? What would life be like without coming home to that patient face, those knowing eyes, that tail that wagged specifically for Marcus in a way that communicated recognition and welcome an uncomplicated affection. Margaret had stayed in touch, sending cards on holidays, inviting Marcus and Rex to fundraisers and awareness events, maintaining the connection that had been forged in crises and had somehow survived the transition to ordinary life. She'd remarried, surprisingly, a widower she'd met at a support group, someone who understood trauma and recovery, who didn't need her to be anything other than who she was, scars and all. They traveled now, carefully, and with the heightened awareness of people who both learned that safety could be taken for granted. But they traveled nonetheless, reclaiming the world that had briefly contracted to the size of a prison disguised as care. Diane had moved closer, accepting a job transfer that let her be within an hour's drive rather than across the country, maintaining the vigilance of someone who'd learned that love required presence, that you couldn't protect people from a distance, that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply be available, be witness, be there. The foundation Margaret had started had grown, funded by her recovered assets, and the donations of others who'd been moved by her story or who had their own experiences with exploitation and abuse. It provided legal assistance, financial counseling, emergency housing, therapeutic supports, all the infrastructure needed to help people escape bad situations and rebuild their lives. Marcus had been asked to join the board, and he'd accepted, seeing it as an extension of the work he already did, a way to influence systems rather than just responding to individual crises. Thomas Brennan remained in prison, his appeals denied, his sentence affirmed. He'd become a case study in criminology courses, an example of a particular type of predator, one who exploited vulnerability systematically and without apparent remorse. Margaret didn't think about him much anymore, she'd told Marcus. Or when she did, it was with something closer to pity than hate, a recognition that whatever had happened to Brennan to make him that way, whatever deficit of empathy or excess of entitlement had shaped him into someone who could methodically destroy other people's lives for profit, had left him fundamentally alone in a way that no amount of stolen money could compensate for. The supermarket had long since returned to its normal rhythm, the site of Margaret's rescue marked now only by a small plaque near the customer service desk, commemorating what had happened and reminding people to pay attention, to be aware, to trust their instincts. When something seemed wrong, employees who'd been there that day had become part of the store's oral history, telling the story to new hires, keeping the memory alive not as tragedy, but as testimony to the possibility of intervention, of making a difference, of being exactly where you needed to be at exactly the right moment. On a spring afternoon 5 years after the initial rescue, Marcus brought Rex to the supermarket one last time in his official capacity. The dog was retiring, 8 years old now, still healthy, but showing his age. Ready for a life of leisure after years of service. The department had organized a small ceremony, a formal recognition of Rex's contributions, his years of finding lost people and detecting danger and serving as the kind of partner that made the work not just bearable but meaningful. Margaret was there, of course, older herself now, her hair completely white, her face carrying the lines of someone who lived through difficulty and come out the other side not unscathed but whole. She stood with Diane and her new husband, day 3. Of them a family unit reforged through crisis and choice, watching as the police chief presented Rex with a certificate of commendation and a basket of gourmet dog treats that Rex eyed with obvious interest. Marcus gave a brief speech, thanking Rex for his service, for his partnership, for being better at this job than most humans could ever hope to be. His voice caught slightly, the emotion he'd been holding at bay finally breaking through. But no one seemed to mind, seemed to understand that this was what authentic feeling looked like. that professionalism didn't require emotional suppression, that it was okay to love your work and your partner, and to grieve even happy transitions. After the ceremony, after the photos and congratulations and the gradual dispersal of the crowd, Marcus found himself alone with Rex in aisle 7, the site where everything had changed. The dog sat beside him, patient as always, waiting for whatever came next, trusting that Marcus would figure it out. "You did good, partner," Marcus said quietly, his hand resting on Rex's head, fingers buried in fur that was still soft despite the silver threading through it. "You did such good work. Saved a lot of people. Made a difference. That's all any of us can hope for, right? To leave things a little better than we found them." Rex looked up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and Marcus could swear the dog understood not the words, perhaps, but the sentiment, the gratitude, the acknowledgement of a job well done, and a partnership that had exceeded the sum of its parts. Margaret approached quietly, respectful of the moment, but wanting to be part of it too. She knelt down, more easily than she had 5 years ago, therapy and time having restored much of what trauma had taken, and she placed both hands on Rex's face, looking at him with an intensity that transcended words. "Thank you," she said, "one last time, for seeing me, for saving me, for reminding me that I mattered, that I was worth saving. I don't know if dogs understand gratitude, but I hope you feel it somehow. I hope you know what you did, what you gave me." Rex licked her face, a gesture of affection, or perhaps just recognition of someone familiar. Someone whose scent had changed from fear to peace over the years they'd known each other. Whatever it meant in the complex internal world of a dog's consciousness, it was enough a closing of the circle, a final connection between rescuer and rescued. Marcus adopted Rex officially the next day. The paperwork, a formality, since they'd already lived together, already been partners, already shared a life. But retirement made it official in a different way, transformed Rex from working dog to family dog, from colleague to companion. They'd have years together still, Marcus hoped. Years of walks and lazy afternoons, and the kind of uncomplicated friendship that only exists between humans and the animals they love. The story of that afternoon in aisle 7 became something of a legend in Valley Ridge, told and retold, embellished in some tellings, simplified in others, but always carrying at its core a truth about paying attention, about the importance of seeing people who'd become invisible, about trusting instincts, even when everything on the surface looked fine. Margaret lived to be 91. Her later years full in ways her middle years had been empty, surrounded by people who loved her and the community. She'd helped build a legacy that extended far beyond her own rescue to touch hundreds of other lives. When she passed peacefully in her sleep, the funeral was attended by dozens of people she'd helped through the foundation. People whose stories paralleled hers, who understood that survival and recovery were possible, that exploitation didn't have to be the end of the story. Marcus and Brex retired, but still vital, still present, came to pay their respects, to honor the woman who'd changed both their lives by having the courage to ask for help and the wisdom to turn her trauma into purpose. As they stood at the edge of the gathering, watching people share memories and tears and laughter, Marcus thought about all the moments that had led to this one, the countless small decisions and coincidences and choices that had aligned to make rescue possible. If he'd been assigned to a different location that day, if Rex hadn't been trained in distress detection, if Margaret hadn't seen that video, hadn't made that gesture, hadn't held on to hope long enough for help to arrive, but all those things had happened, had aligned in that perfect, improbable way that makes you wonder whether the universe is random or whether sometimes, just sometimes, there is a pattern, a purpose, a logic that transcends coincidence. Rex leaned against his leg, warm and solid and real, and Marcus rested his hand on the dog's head, feeling the steady breathing, the living presence of a partner who taught him more about courage and instinct and service than any human instructor ever could. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber, transforming the ordinary world into something momentarily transcendent. And Marcus thought about Margaret's words from years ago about being invisible until someone saw her. We're all invisible until we're seen, he thought. We all need someone to notice, to care, to refuse to look away. Sometimes that someone is a dog. Sometimes it's a stranger. Sometimes it's ourselves, finally seeing our own worth after years of being told we have none. The important thing is that someone sees, that someone cares, that the signal, however it's given, is received, and that when rescue comes, in whatever form it takes, we're brave enough to accept it.